Hi, my name is Claas. Thank you for tuning in on this video. In this presentation I'm going to be talking about the pluralization of presentational haber as is observed in Caribbean Spanish. As you might know, in normative Spanish, haber is used as an impersonal verb. This means that the MP argument in the example on the poster, niños, children, does not function as a subject but rather as direct object, and as a result the verb presents default third-person singular verb agreement. However, in many Latin American varieties, if not all, the verb does agree with the MP argument, such that speakers use and accept both había and habían niños en el parque in order to express there were children in the park. These examples can be found on the poster behind me. Although this is a widely studied variable in Latin American Spanish, nobody has really evaluated its use in the Caribbean varieties, and therefore, in this presentation, I'm going to try to answer the following research questions. First, what is the linguistic distribution of the pluralization presentational haber in Caribbean Spanish? What is the social distribution of the pluralization presentational haber in Havana, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and San Juan, Puerto Rico? And how can these distributions be explained in cognitive construction grammar? As is already evident from the third research question, the theoretical framework that will be assumed in this study is Goldberg's cognitive construction grammar. As you might know, this is a usage-based framework of language which holds that constructions capture both broad generalizations, such as transitivity, and idiosyncratic patterns, such as words or idioms. For example, in a simple sentence like John takes the glass, there are 5 constructions, each with their own meaning, namely John takes the glass, and the transitive pattern, subject-verb-object, which according to Lanker denotes a flow of energy, a transfer of energy from the subject-agent participant to the object-patient participant. In other words, in this theoretical framework, the grammar is reduced to a network of constructions that offer speakers symbols to express conceptualizations. Against the background of this theoretical framework, I would like to propose the following main hypothesis, indicated here. In Havana, Santo Domingo and San Juan, the pluralization of presentational haber corresponds to a slowly advancing language change from below. The personal presentational construction with haber, log haber subject, is replacing the impersonal presentational construction with this verb. The variants only differ with regard to the syntactic function in the noun phrase, which in the impersonal variant is an object, and in the personal variant is subject, and the social meanings associated with the relative frequencies. Of course, this is a very abstract hypothesis which on its own does not allow us to model anything. However, through a series of general principles of language organization, use, and change, this hypothesis actually entails a list of more detailed extrapolations. For example, if we take into account Langer's notion of markers of coding, we can expect that subject-like nominal arguments will favor the personal variant. In addition, in the usage-based perspective, it is usually assumed that if a particular form occurs mainly with high frequency in one pattern, but only sporadically in other patterns, it will be stored mentally as a special case, as a partially lexically filled construction schema of that more abstract pattern, which greatly disfavors its use in competing constructions. If such a situation existed for a particular verb form of haber before the actuation of a change, we come to the second hypothesis. We can derive the second hypothesis, namely, if a particular form of haber was not used frequently outside of the presentational pattern before the actuation of a change, this verb tense will disfavor the personal variant, provided the coding of conceptualization does not call for aspectual or modal auxiliaries. Furthermore, research in both psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics has shown that speakers tend to recycle the abstract argument structure patterns that have appeared in prior discourse. And therefore we come to the third hypothesis. There will be structural priming effects. In addition, as this variation is a change from below, as is argued by the main hypothesis, I expect to find that the variation will conform to the principles of linguistic change above formulates for this type of language change, which is the fourth hypothesis. And finally, if this is a change from below, an ongoing linguistic change, it is only reasonable to assume that the 3 varieties will represent different stages of evolution towards a personal variant. In order to test these hypotheses and the main hypothesis, I recollect the sample of 3 times 24 speakers in Havana, Cuba, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. In each of the 3 cities, the sample is stratified by age, gender, and academic achievement. To gain access to more variable contexts, I structured the recording sessions into 3 sections. The first section consisted of a typical sociolinguistic interview of about 30 minutes of duration, in which I asked the speakers to talk about their day-to-day life. During the second section, I instructed speakers to read out loud a 2-page child story, in which you had to fill in gaps with presentational haber or a distractive verb. The last section was a questionnaire test in which speakers had to repeat the same task as in the questionnaire test, but in isolated sentences. Subsequently, this sample was post-stratified by social class, which is a measure of academic achievement, housing, and profession. After transcription of the recording sessions and the selection of the cases and the coding of the case for social and linguistic variables, I performed a mixed effect VARBRUL analysis using Daniel E. Johnson's VARBRUL. In this analysis, I included the individual speakers and NP's head nouns as random intercepts. Using these methods, I analyzed a corpus of almost 5,000 occurrences of haber and a plural NP. As you can see in the chart in the bottom of the poster, there are no considerable differences between the 3 varieties when it comes to the use of the personal and impersonal variant of the presentational construction with haber. Perhaps what is useful to remember from this general distribution is that San Juan clearly represents the lowest overall rate of pluralization, followed by Havana, and finally Santo Domingo, which represents the most advanced stage of this change. Turning now to the results that were obtained for the specific factor groups that were tested in the investigation, you can see on the center top part of the poster that, as was expected, those tenses that occurred mainly in the presentational construction before the actuation of the change turn out to disfavor the personal variant, at least whenever the coding of the conceptualization the speaker wishes to express does not call for aspectual or modal auxiliaries. In other words, at least whenever the entrenched instance of haber in the impersonal variant of the presentational construction can be used. Because when we look at the data for more complex conceptualizations that cannot be expressed using these entrenched instances, we see that the personal variant is used as frequently in the preterit and present tense as in other verb tenses. Turning now to priming effects, you can see that on the 2 charts below that for the charts for the verb tense, that generally speaking the results pattern as was predicted by hypothesis 3, namely personal variance, prime personal variance, and impersonal variance, prime impersonal variance. This clearly supports the third hypothesis and suggests that haber occurs in 2 argument structure constructions, because if there weren't 2 argument structure constructions that could be repeated, we would not expect to find priming effects regardless of variations in verb form. In addition, when we take a look at the inherent agentivity of the nouns reference, we see that inherently agentive nouns, that is to say nouns that are easily imaginable as starting points in an action change in a series of events, clearly favor the personal variant, as agentivity is a key feature of prototypical subjects. This supports the first hypothesis. Turning now to the polarity of the clause, although polarity has not been connected in typological literature with any grammatical function, I would like to argue here that it can be used to test for object-like and subject-like characteristics with presentational haber. Namely, Prince argues that in affirmative clauses, the NP always has a specific indefinite reading. However, when we negate the sentence, when we introduce negation, the reference of the NP is suspended such that it's only interpretable as a type or a non-specific indefinite NP, which is the default definiteness specificity value of direct objects. The personal variant is far less frequent in negative contexts, at least in San Juan. In Havana, and Santo Domingo, the differences between negative and positive affirmative contexts are only evident for the second generation, with some differences in significance, because in Havana, this contrast is highly significant for the second generation and marginally significant for the first generation, whereas it is only marginally significant for the second generation and not significant at all for the first generation. This of course shows that the personal variant is being extended in Havana and Santo Domingo into domains that were formerly reserved for the impersonal variant. In other words, that there is a change in progress. Turning now to social variables, we see that social class is a relevant indexical meaning in Havana and Santo Domingo, and that in Santo Domingo, even moreover, the data shows the typical curvilinear pattern of changes from below. However, in Havana, the variation between the personal and impersonal variant seems to be expressing a social meaning of social class, but the high frequent use of the personal variant is connected to the lower class. And when we take a look now at the data for San Juan, we see that only for the second generation the social meaning of social class is relevant. There are no differences between the speakers of different class in the first generation. Finally, when it comes to gender, only in San Juan is this a relevant social meaning at the level of the speech community, with the expected results, namely women favor the personal variant. In Santo Domingo, this is only evident for the first generation, whereas in Havana, the results for gender are completely opposite for the two generations. Namely, in the first generation, the higher use of the personal variant indexes male gender, whereas in the second generation, indexes female gender. The results have been discussed up until now lead to the following conclusions. First, the pluralization of haber constitutes an alternation between two variants of the presentational construction with this verb, which signals social meaning. Second, three general principles of language organization and use constrain variation, namely structural priming, which was discussed here. Statistical preemption, which discourages the use of a personal variant for conceptualization that can be encoded using entrenched instances of the impersonal variant. Whereas, finally, the preference for unmarked coding encourages the use of the personal variant with more prototypical subjects and vice versa. When it comes to the nature of the variation, we have seen that for Santo Domingo and San Juan, the variation is correctly described as a slowly progressing ongoing language change from below. By contrast, in Havana, variation has acquired a social meanings of masculinity and lower class in the second half of the 20th century, which are at the moment hindering its diffusion. The discussion up until now also shows that the three varieties represent different stages of the evolution towards a personal variant. This is most importantly evident from the differing results for the social variables and the difference in significance that were reported for the variable polarity of the clause. This is all I have to say about this research. I hope you've liked my presentation and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.